All right, in this video, I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the fall of the USSR. All right, first thing you know, just a little bit of background. The relationship between the United States and the USSR had its ups and downs. There were many periods of, with the Cold War where it was really, really intense, especially during Truman's administration. But you can see in the 1970s, there was a period known as détente. And that literally means just a cooling down of tensions. So, for example, during the Nixon administration, the US and the USSR engaged in talks. They actually signed a treaty to reduce missiles. And this period of détente, of cooling of tensions, lasted basically until the USSR invaded Afghanistan. And that's when things went back to being much more very negative and, back to kind of the standard Cold War posturing. All right, the other thing you need to know, just to have background, is that one of the issues with a communist economy is it just doesn't work that good. When the government tries to run the economy, it's very common to see shortages, pricing isn't handled appropriately, things like that. I mean, you can see in the photograph, this was pretty common during that era of communist economy in the USSR, that there would be lines for everything, toilet paper, food, what have you. Prices were low, but the lines were really short. The last thing you should know is, as I said, that period of détente, of cooling down of tensions had ended. By the time Ronald Reagan takes over, he is much more aggressive with regard to the Soviet Union. He was pretty famous for referring to them as the evil empire, and he actually pushed for the development of long story short, it would have been, it was called SDI, but the nickname it was given was Star Wars. And this initiative was that if the Soviet Union had launched a missile, the idea was that the missile would be intercepted in space and never would be able to reach the United States. Of course, trying to get around that issue of mutually assured destruction. If the United States had a missile shield that prevented nuclear weapons from reaching the United States, it would change the balance of power in the arms race. All right, so with this background in place, Gorbachev takes power in the Soviet Union, and he's relatively young, and he's known as a reformer. So he wants to, he's got a couple of things in mind that he wants to accomplish. The first thing is perestroika, which is, as it says, an economic restructuring. He wants to fix the Soviet economy. He wants to move the country closer to a free market and restructure the Soviet economy. The second thing is glasnost. Glasnost is this policy of openness. The Soviet Union, of course, practiced censorship. It didn't have a free media. It was a totalitarian government. And this policy of glasnost is the opposite of this. He wants to get away from that totalitarian past. He actually wants to start reforms that move the country towards democracy, allowing citizens of the USSR to vote, to have more say in their government, and so on. And this other piece is the SALT Treaty. Again, as part of Gorbachev, he also wanted to reposition the Soviet Union, as he wanted to get away from people thinking the USSR is an evil empire. So he sits down with Ronald Reagan. He signs the SALT Treaty, which is, again, a treaty to limit nuclear weapons. And he even withdraws troops from Yugoslavia. So this was a real radical change in direction for the Soviet Union. One of the things, really what was one of the most shocking things that Gorbachev did, was he announced a plan of non-intervention in Eastern Europe. What do I mean by that? Right after World War II, if you remember with Stalin, Stalin had said he would not allow Eastern Europe to have free elections. The countries of Eastern Europe became satellite nations of the USSR. Remember, we've referred to them as countries behind the Iron Curtain. And these countries were all forced to maintain Soviet governments. And there had been a few times in history where the people of countries, for example, in Czechoslovakia, the people had tried to put non-communists in their government, and as soon as they tried to do that, the Soviet Union rolled in with tanks to stop them and to force them to take back, to put back in place a communist government. So when Gorbachev said he wasn't going to intervene, this really kind of, it now opens the door for Eastern Europe to move away from communism. And the first country to do that is Poland. What happens is Lech Walesa, he was the head of Solidarity, which was a labor union. And the labor union had a labor strike, and it ended up going across the country. And you have to remember, again, in a communist economy, the government and the business interests in the government are one and the same, because everything is centrally planned. Everything is controlled by the government. So when a labor union goes against the business, you can see it's like you're rebelling against the government. And this, again, in keeping with Gorbachev's stated policy of non-intervention, this labor movement is allowed to continue. And eventually the government of Poland will fall. And that's the first country in Eastern Europe to no longer have a communist government. Instead, it's replaced with a democratic government. Actually, Lech Walesa becomes the first non-communist leader of Poland. And naturally, after it works in Poland, all the other countries in Eastern Europe change over as well. The only one that didn't make a bloodless change to non-communism was in Romania. There, Nicholas Ceausescu fought against it. He, the people were rebelling. He stood against them. He sent his army out to shoot his own people, his own citizens. What happens is the army changes sides, and Ceausescu and his wife are executed. And again, Romania eliminates its communist government. And then of course the big, the big momentous change, and that really symbolizes the end of the Cold War, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. All right. Again, it's now suddenly, before, if people from West Berlin had tried to cross, if people from East Berlin, which was the communist half, had tried to cross into West Berlin, they would have been shot. They would have been killed. And lo and behold, they open up the wall. They allow free movement between the two halves of the city. And eventually the country itself is going to be reunited. All right, and so again, I mentioned before this idea of democratization, that Gorbachev is going to allow free, contested elections. So what happens is, in the old days, the Soviet Union, the Communist Party would say, all right, you can vote, but you can vote for candidate A, B, or C, because only those three candidates were approved by the party. Now, different story. The people can elect whoever they want. So that was democratization. The rise of nationalism. Now, this is really big. I'm actually going to go back to this other slide. You can see the picture in the bottom left. This is a political cartoon. You can see the idea is that when Gorbachev unleashes these forces of glasnost, of perestroika, of allowing this country to change, he doesn't realize what he's unleashed. This little baby, is going to have unintended consequences. One of those consequences is, if you look to the center, this rise of nationalism. What ends up happening is, as Gorbachev allows the countries of Eastern Europe to choose their own government and to have more freedom, inside the Soviet Union, a lot of the republics start feeling the same way, that they want more control and they want self-government for themselves. Because you have to remember, the USSR is a collection of republics. Russia is simply the largest republic. And of course, that's the republic that includes Moscow. But you also have Georgia, and Georgia isn't filled with Russians. Georgia's filled with Georgians. And there's Ukraine. And Ukraine is a republic in the Soviet Union. It doesn't have Russians in it. it has Ukrainians in it, and Estonia, and Latvia, and Lithuania, and Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, and all these republics all start feeling nationalism, that they no longer want to be part of the USSR, that they want to be separate countries. And that is going to be, again, if you remember from our um, uh, nationalism lesson way back when we talked about Otto von Bismarck and we talked about how it brought together Germany, it brought together Italy. You should also remember nationalism can also tear empires apart. Remember what it did to the Ottoman Empire. Remember what it did to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, right? Well, the same thing's going to happen in the USSR. USSR was an empire that's getting ripped apart by the forces of nationalism, just like we saw in the Ottoman Empire, just like we saw in the Austrian Empire. All right, so what that leads to is Lithuania is the first republic to declare independence. I don't know if you remember, after World War II, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, right, that they promised not to attack each other. And the price for Stalin to sign that agreement with Hitler was that Hitler said, all right, in exchange for signing this agreement with me, Stalin, I will allow you to take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All right, so these are three countries. Between World War I and World War II, they had independence, and those three republics get added to the Soviet Union in the wake of signing that signing the non-intervention pact with Hitler. So Lithuania is a country that had been, had a period of time where it was an independent country, and it said, we no longer want to be part of the USSR. We want to break. But what happens is, as opposed to the attitude that Gorbachev took with Eastern Europe, he has a completely different attitude when it comes to republics that want to break away. When it came to Eastern Europe, if they wanted to go non-communist, they were more than welcome to. But with the republics, it was different. When Lithuania said it wanted to break away, Gorbachev said no, sent in troops. What happens is as you start seeing more and more republics looking for more and more self-rule, they want more and more rights, the conservative members of the Communist Party, the people who don't like Gorbachev's ideas, those are the people who like the way, when you say somebody's a conservative, that generally means that the person likes it the old way. They like an old-fashioned way. They like it in the good old days kind of thing. They do not like change. Conservatives don't like change. It's usually what it means. And in this, during this period, those conservative forces inside the Communist Party are horrified with these changes that Gorbachev has made. And as far as they're concerned, Gorbachev lost them Eastern Europe, and he was in the process of losing all of the republics of the USSR. So they plan a coup, C-O-U-P, but it's pronounced coup. And a coup means basically they're going to get the army together to take Gorbachev prisoner. They're going to, capture him, and they're going to force a change in the government. What ends up happening is they send the tanks out. They start, merging on the government buildings in Moscow. And the figure in the center that's holding the piece of paper, that is Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin organizes resistance to the coup, and the army ends up changing sides. The army changes sides, the coup fails. Once the coup fails, Yeltsin is in a position, and he says he becomes the most powerful kind of politician in Russia. He has Russia declare the Communist Party illegal. The Communist Party becomes illegal in Russia. Once the Communist Party is illegal in Russia, the rest of the republics follow suit, and next thing you know, there's basically no more USSR. There's no more Communist Party that's in charge of everyone. Basically, Gorbachev was in charge of a country that no longer existed. And what you see is all of these republics that used to belong to the USSR are now separate, independent countries. So Yeltsin becomes elected president of Russia. So you figure, okay, great, now we all live happily ever after, right? Not so fast. Instead, what ends up happening is the switch over from communism to capitalism is very, very, very difficult. Okay? As you can see in the cartoon, these two people are looking in the window at a bakery. They said communism was waiting 2 hours to buy bread. Capitalism is waiting 2 years to be able to afford it. And that's what ends up happening. Prices for goods in Russia go sky high. 800% inflation, massive corruption, shortages. It was a really, really rocky time in Russia's history. The switch over to capitalism from a command economy was very, very rough, very, very disruptive. All right, one of the other side effects of the fall of the USSR is what ended up happening in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was an area that had a communist government, and after the fall of the USSR, Yugoslavia was made up of a number of different republics, including Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia-Herzegovina was one of the republics. There were other republics. Bosnia was another republic, and so on and so forth. What happens in Bosnia-Herzegovina is the Bosnian people in the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina end up murdering the Muslims that live there. So it was a period of ethnic cleansing. And later, there was another rebellion in Kosovo, which again is just this disruption as nationalist forces, as these different ethnic groups within this country are no longer being controlled by a powerful totalitarian communist government. Violence explodes, okay? The person you need to know, Slobodan, I'm mispronouncing that, Milosevic. Milosevic is the leader in Serbia. He is the person that historians hold responsible for this period of ethnic cleansing. As you can see on the left, I mean, people were held in concentration camps. You can see they're not being fed. On the bottom left, this is one of many mass graves that are found in the former Yugoslavia, where it was a site of just really terrible bloodshed and a lot of violence. Today, the leader of Russia is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, basically, the concern is, I say return to totalitarianism. They're not quite there yet. I'm being a little hyperbolic with that headline. They haven't really returned to totalitarianism yet. However, they're not exactly a democracy either. Vladimir Putin has basically positioned himself as the leader of Russia since 1998 and changed the constitution to keep himself in power. There was like a short blip where he wasn't the prime minister, he became president, but it was like for just a few years, and while he was president, the person who served as prime minister was basically his puppet. So even though he didn't have the job, he still ran the country. And so he's very, very powerful. He absolutely controls the media. He's pretty infamous for the fact that if anyone stands against him, they get murdered. He just recently was held responsible for the attempted death of two former Russian people who lived in Britain, where they were poisoned. But there's a number of journalists and political figures who have been poisoned by Vladimir Putin and either murdered or there's been attempted murders of a lot. I mean, I'm talking a laundry list of people. If you've seen on the news, you should also be aware that Vladimir Putin is being held responsible for interfering with the U.S. elections. There's just another recent report that came out that said he positively, absolutely interfered in the elections, specifically in an attempt to prevent Americans from electing Hillary Clinton and to create doubt and mistrust in the democratic process and to kind of, tear people apart. He also is responsible for annexing Crimea. Crimea used to be part of Ukraine, And now it is no longer part of Ukraine. It's now part of the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of violence. He has spoken. I mean, he basically, as with many Russians, that Gorbachev is, generally seen in very positive terms in the West, but in Russia, a lot of people hate his guts because they feel like he turned the country that was, this great superpower into, he really destroyed it. And Vladimir Putin has openly said, like, he wants to go back to having a strong Russia and to being a world power again. And the other thing you need to be aware of is NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, if you remember from the Cold War slides, NATO was a military alliance that was headed up by the United States. And remember, it was NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. All right, well, once the USSR falls, the question is, okay, if there's no Warsaw Pact, what do you need NATO for? Right? NATO only existed to be, against Warsaw Pact. And what's ended up happening is, in the absence of the Warsaw Pact, since the Soviet Union fell, since there no longer is this, other side to go against, NATO has taken on a new role. And its new role is this idea of an international peacekeeping force. What happens is the United Nations, sometimes it can be very hard to pull together a United Nations force. First off, because their only role is in peacekeeping, so that limits them. And then secondly, because it takes a full vote of the Security Council, a lot of times China and Russia may block a vote to do something. So NATO is a second option. If the United Nations won't do it, NATO will. So for example, NATO was the one to bomb Kosovo to stop that ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the country formerly known as Yugoslavia. All right, so again, I guess this is basically the fall of the USSR in kind of one quick, actually two graphics. So if you want to flip through that really fast, and then here's the second half of it. All right, so that's it. I'm going to leave you. Please check out the next video that's going to talk about current issues.